It's hard to believe, but this is our last virtual seminar of the academic year. However, I hope to see you again in May 11th. We will do like concluding remarks, and Michaela and I, we are working on with some stuff in the works, so we should be able to have some fun announcements for you regarding the summer. We are not going to know our fall schedule yet, but I will be sending out basically like a form you can complete to let me know if you want to present next year. But we do have some stuff in the works for the summer, so tune in on May 11 and you will find out. Okay. As for today, we will hear from Abigail Devereaux. I'm sure most of you, maybe everyone, knows Abby. Abby just graduated from George Mason University last year with her Ph.D. She wrote her dissertation with Dick Wagner, and today's presentation comes out of that work from her dissertation. She's currently at the Wichita State University in the business school, teaching economics. Yes, primarily economics, right? Or yes, economics. And I should probably mention, while at George Mason, she was a fellow with Mercatus, and at NYU, she won a Kirzner Award for her dissertation, and she has already published in the Journal of Institutional Economics, Journal of Entrepreneurship, Public Policy, Cosmos and Taxes, American Economists, and many other places. And her interests are quite wide-ranging. So we have well, but related, right? So complexity economics, agent-based, computational, macro, game theory, right? Okay. So that's all I think you need to know from me, Abby. The screen is yours.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to just share screen, go to my PowerPoint, because I'm an expert at this now. We all are after this year, aren't we, who have been teaching. Okay. There we are. Oh. Can you see? Good. Great, thank you. However, I'm going to minimize you so I can see my own slides. All right. So this is a talk that's a combination of a few talks I've been giving recently at Public Choice Society this spring. I talked about how this theory connects to polycentricity. So this is the Austrian polycentricity, first talked about really by Vincent Ostrom. And so Synecological Systems Theory is the name of my dissertation, and the primary focus is about really spontaneous order. So something Dick Wagner and I talked about quite a lot in our meetings with each other is how spontaneous order seems to be one of the primary stories of social theory that has so far been really ignored formalistically. Almost, well, really explicitly ignored in traditional economic theory, for instance, the theory that has the most formalism available. So one thing that I really was interested in doing is uncovering this source of synergy. So synergy is kind of like the extra stuff that you get when you combine, two plus things together. So the idea of spontaneous order being that, once we have, more than just Robinson Crusoe on his island, but we're, chaining, 2 Crusoes, 3 Crusoes on their own respective islands, and these sorts of things. At a certain point, you start getting behavior in the system that we can call complex, or patterns in the system that aren't something that we can represent in sort of a linear way as a sum of the parts of the system. So it's not simple aggregation. So we have behavior in the system, by which I mean patterns of whatever indicators that you use to characterize the system. This could be, I don't know, Crusoe's number of coconuts, or the total number of coconuts in the system, or something like this, or coconuts traded, or whatever you want in the Crusoe example. At some point, you get at some point you get patterns of these indicators that don't look simply aggregated. So this is the idea of complex systems. So Dick and I have been working on Synecological Systems Theory for some time. So I would say we started really talking about this in 2017, 18. And this was simply in the context of game theory and sort of using game theory, using the theoretical structure of game theory as a potential inroad to express this synergy. And so we have one paper published through American Economist that's about contrasting dynamic stochastic general equilibrium and what we call open-ended evolutionary social systems theory or macroeconomics. And one that so far I'm still working on to get published, and this is just me not having a lot of time in my first year, and this is game theory, social theory. This is where we really lay out Synecological systems theory, and then my sort of opus there, my dissertation, where I go through this. So the motivation here, particularly when it comes to using games as a way to represent synergy, or this synergistic channels of entanglement, as I like to call them, is to really understand gameplay in a more realistic setting. So this is kind of how I've been able to boil this down. Players have fundamental knowledge and computation constraints. So this is important because one of the main assumptions of traditional game theory, of course, is that players do not have fundamental knowledge and computation constraints. There's some forms of game theory that provide some level of constraints on these things, but generally players are still able to use a Bayesian learning formalism, whereby they have access to distributions, which unrestricted access to distributions. And of course, computation constraints come into algorithmic game theory or mechanism design more formally. So there are some parts of game theory that take these things into account, but not really in a holistic way, I'd say. My other motivation is there's no presumed external political actor or designer. So all rule makers are inside this system. They have to be inside and not outside the model. This makes modeling really much more difficult, but I think it's necessary to do this. So why do I want to model games in this way? I want to be able to endogenize self-organizational processes to solve social dilemmas. And remember, if we have rule makers and designers in the system, you can also then compare and contrast self-organizational processes to, say, rulemaking or designing within the system. You can also get a model of sorts here for meso-level institutional configurations. So Dopfer and Potts, Jason Potts, introduced this notion of what they call the meso layer. So we have microeconomics, which everyone is familiar with, of course, and this individual action. This is a sort of Misesian human action. And you have macroeconomics, which this is sort of the level of patterns and trends and indicators. And then the meso layer is in between. And so the meso layer is where we have organizational structures that aren't, that are sort of embedded within the system, and that constitute sort of these action arenas where action is taking place according to certain rules, maybe, and in contexts that are defined by the institutions in this meso layer. So, having a model of sorts for these institutional configurations, their formation, which have to be a dynamic model, their explanation, which you can do in a one-shot, static way. Institutional change is a big one, right? Very big one. And prediction, of course. So Synecology, what do we mean by this? So Synecology, we borrowed this from I saw it first in Rogers' expert failure book. And I'm like, ooh, I like this word a lot. And so I looked it up, and it's an ecological term. It's about interactions between individuals and their communities. So this is opposed to autocology, which studies interactions between individuals and their environments. And so you can think of synecology as in contrast to aggregated autocology. Aggregated autocology would be like representative agent macroeconomics, where you're just aggregating individuals. Synecology contrasts with that because it acknowledges synergy. It acknowledges the creation of additional states or information when you combine two or more things, as I was talking about in the beginning. So the thrust behind this theory is to demonstrate the rising up of new solutions from the structure. So when you, in our entangled political research, entangled political economy research network here, we talk a lot about the structure of the system being as important to understanding the outcomes of systemic action, of individual action within systems, as just looking at individual or understanding and being able to describe individual action. And so the structure is very important. And so we can, just from simply the structure, I want to show in synecological games of overlapping games, where not all players in the system play all games. You can see new solutions arise. So this result obviously has a nice spontaneous order quality to it, and it has this sense for which you get extra stuff, and the whole that you have after combining these elements is not equal to the simple sum of its parts. Synecological also refers to Rogers' definition of synecological knowledge. And so this was, he has an epistemological schema that he calls select knowledge. This is synecological, evolutionary, exosomatic, constitutive, tacit. I'm not going to go through all of these categories. You can watch Roger talk about expert failure. I'm sure it's on YouTube, or he can explain to you afterwards. But these categories are rooted in ancient Greek ideas on how to classify knowledge themselves. So this idea of the classifications of knowledge having these different aspects is very old. And synecological knowledge is knowledge that's encoded in sort of the social context of interactions. So institutional configurations can have this knowledge whereby individuals can, say, interact with them using simple rules of thumb. They don't have to understand the point and purpose of all of these institutions and why they are embedded in them in a certain way. They can simply act within these embeddings and gain knowledge from the embeddings, and you be able to utilize that knowledge to improve their outcomes, and not even have to know that this is what they're getting. So, cultures where there's a high level of trustworthiness, people can then just interact with each other without really having to know that, oh yes, it's a high level of trustworthiness that's allowing my interactions to be largely successful. They can just simply interact within the system, and maybe that high level of trustworthiness is being maintained or sustained by a certain institutional configuration. This is the idea of synecological knowledge. So synecological game theory then is an instantiation of synecological systems theory. Synecological systems theory is more general. Synecological game theory is just a way of formally instantiating it. So my hypotheses that I have yet to show, and they're not assumed in, as they are in other multiple games theory work, which I'll discuss a little bit later if I have time. So players condition strategies to best attain the goals of their overall plan. And actions chosen by an agent at any given time are at least somewhat affected by an agent's overall plan. Action will therefore tend to coordinate plans at the system level. So that's just to highlight and emphasize this. So agent action is taken with respect to an overall plan that spans several games, at least two. Okay. Just checking the chat, I have you all small, so that I should probably at least have a little bit up here in case I'm running out of time.
Don't feel the need to interrupt your talk for my comments' sake.
Okay, sure. So Synecological systems, the way that you can, that I have in my dissertation is this simple system here. So the gammas, the numbered gammas are games. The numbers by themselves are players. The arrows are the sequence of play of the games. First, 1 in 3 games are played, then the game number 2 is played. The ordering is just arbitrary here. I think I went from left to right. And membership in games is indicated by the dotted red line. So so we have a simple synecological system with 3 games and 4 players. And I can show by representing these games as particular kinds of games that you can get a 4th game that emerges from the interaction of agents within this particular configuration of games. So you get a new game here that arises to be played between 1 and 4. This is an indirect game. So this, I don't know if indirect game is a thing, but it is a thing in synecological game theory. I mean, a thing as in something that is, I haven't seen it anywhere in the literature, but it's a game that is being played that agents aren't aware that they are playing, but they're playing. And so the structure of this game that arises here depends on the structure of these 3 games. And this structure may not be unique. In fact, I have an example where I have particular instantiations of these games where 1 and 3 are principal agent games, and 2 is a kind of a market trading game, where this number 4 that spontaneously arises could be a prisoner's dilemma or an insurance game, and I'm still working on what other games it could possibly represent. And also I'm working on the abstraction of what a synergistic channel of entanglement means. So how many games it can that you can tune into on these synergistic channels, given the underlying games represented here. So I demonstrate this for simultaneous one-shot games in Devereaux 2020. This is my dissertation. I believe Dick and I also talk about it in the working paper up on SSRN, Game Theory of Social Theory. And the channels of behavior alteration in synecological games are distinct from multi-stage and repeated game conditional strategies. This is something I want to be very clear about, because when I was presenting synecological games early on, the biggest pushback I got is, isn't this just multi-stage games? Isn't this just repeated games? And it's not. Topologically, it's not. And also, I go through in my dissertation and show that that you have a coupling between players that is of the kind that is not, that is distinct from multi-stage and repeated games. Also, knowledge is fundamentally distinct. So knowledge of history has to be complete and shared by all players in multi-stage and repeated games. And this is just fundamentally not true and not accessible and not approximatable. So I have some formal definitions here. I usually short synecological system as syn system. And so there's some formalism that I've developed here about it. And I'm going to kind of just leave out if one wants to pause on YouTube. It's it's just directed acyclic graphs of components, and I define then components a certain way. You have to have a certain size number of these components that are linked together and connected in a particular way. That's the directed acyclic graph. This just means that time flows in a certain direction and there's an end. And it's acyclic in that the end is not then looped back to the beginning. So components are action arenas, and then I formalize that in a certain way. Certain population of agents that have personal characteristics, much like agent-based models, resource vectors, input vectors, or rule sets that associates this set of things, actions, resources, input topology, with outcomes. And outcomes may not be real numbers. In fact, the game that I was showing you above with this guy happening, the outcomes in this principal agent game are wages until profits are determined in the market game, and then the players in this game can remunerate the agents here. So the wages that are obtained are only determined after the game is played here. So at first, the agents in the principal agent game do not know what their wages are going to be. So this is an important point also. And there's just different kinds of components, ones that occur within a game chain and ones that occur at the end. And plans here are directed chains of components, which could be games, right? Such that a certain agent participates in all the components sequentially. So the plan is just a plan for a certain agent. I is going to be, that the first game that agent plays in, the second, third, fourth. And the agent, generally, at first, I'm not going to have the agent playing in parallel games, although we do, of course, have parallel plans. We parallelize all sorts of plans, and those parallel plans interact within each other. At first, I'm just going to have a single plan for each agent. So I'm assuming, at least at first, that agents aren't playing two games simultaneously. And the adjacency network here is just is just defining the nearest neighbors of any given component. And the component, remember, it's a game. So its nearest neighbors will also be games. And so this is important when you're trying to analogize games to action arenas. And this ties into some of the work being done by Austrian workshop folks like Michael McGinnis on networks of adjacent action arenas. So this is me trying to also get into that type of representation. So I define a synecological game here. This just means that so at least one player, but not all players, are shared between sequential games. No single player spans the entire extended games. This is the no dictator conditions. No single player is going to span the entire synecological system, is what this means. So synecological systems are at least two plans in size, two different agents plans in size. So that's a minimal size. And then I define sort of entanglement here between payoffs, and this occurs between sequential games. And I'm not sure, but I think this entanglement condition is what gets us these indirect games to spontaneously emerge. This is something I'm still proving. There's a lot of work to be done. So synecological systems are really ecologies of plans, and this is, Dick Wagner has a 2012 paper on the macroeconomy as an ecology of plans in JABO, and this was one of the biggest inspirations for me in terms of my work. And so I have plans here are in different colors. So you have plan here that's red, plan 3, and the large circles are components or games in this case, and the arrows show the sequence that they're being played in. Now, with the flow of time, you can never have one of these plans loop backwards and have arrows all must be going in the same direction. And this is due to the knowledge condition that you can't have this player playing with this player before they play here. So there's an issue with time here and a contradiction if you have two arrows opposing each other. So, oh yeah, and let's see, right. So this is kind of what the system would look like. Now, you can have easy examples about how choices span not just single action arenas, right? And I think it's important to think in terms of plan primitives to come up with these examples. So you notice that plans are sequential, that you have to do one thing before the next thing happens. These are like production. It's like production. It's like a Hayekian production, where we have intermediate stages that must occur before a final product, and you have this sense of time, of an actual positive amount of time that you have to traverse in these intermediate stages before you can then reach this. The sense of time is encoded in this system, in this framework, and a single player will span any whole plan. And so we have this synecological game here we can see in terms of plans, and this just indicates that for some of the players, the plans are incomplete. So there's some missing parts that occur outside. Models are always wrong, so any kind of system that we're looking at is always going to have some fragments. So we're never going to be looking at the whole picture. So this is just me indicating that in this sense. Let's see, yeah, within firms, projects are plans managed by project managers, right? So you can then talk about within firm, you can have this kind of synecological systems theory also be applicable to within firm studies. This is something that I'm actually looking forward to doing. I have an old agent-based model of the division of labor within a work team that I'm looking to use synecological systems theory and marry that together and finally get it like published. And so this is something that individuals, of course, have personal and professional plans that span different action arenas over time. So multiple games theory has long literature. It's a nascent area of study, so it's new. There's perhaps maybe 12 people working on it. I haven't counted them all. I know at least 3 people I've met who are working on it. Jenna Bednar and Scott Page at Michigan are sort of at the forefront of this, and they work predominantly on cultural transmission within and between ensembles of games. And so this is different from synecological game theory. Agents are explicitly cognitively constrained to using only very simple strategies for the games that they're playing, and ensembles of games are spanned by all of the agents who play it. So there's no sense for which you have non-spanning agents. But they demonstrate some really interesting things: behavioral stickiness, behavioral variance, cultural variance between clusters of populations, and consistency within the individual. Ecologies of games. This is Mark Lubell, I believe. Smaldino, Norton Long. Norton Long, I didn't put the date on this. I think it's like 1956. He was one of the first people talking about ecologies of games. And mostly these frameworks, both the cultural multiple games and also the ecologies of games framework, they are focusing on strategy, on strategizing, and they're placing constraints then on strategy types, and that's kind of how they talk about multiple games. But I focus instead on naturally limiting agent knowledge by utilizing the structure of the system itself. By that structure representing the constraints on knowledge. So the killer app for me would be polycentricity, right? If I can marry my synecological systems theory. If I can show I have a polycentricity, I can represent polycentricity within this theory. That's my killer app. So what is this? We all are probably familiar, but out there in YouTube land, you might not be. we have Vincent Ostrom, I think Thibault, and a couple other people also wrote, very famous people, and I should have just included them all. In 1961, they talked about a polycentric political system, and this is Ostrom quoting basically himself. And this system is many autonomous units that are formally independent of one another, that choose to act, people who choose to act in ways that take account of others, and through processes of cooperation, competition, conflict, and conflict resolution. Now, this is 61. You would think that we would have integrated this into econ theory since, but no. In fact, this many autonomous units formally independent of each other is pretty much all we've been able to represent in econ theory. And choosing to act in ways that take account of each other's is kind of like is the cutting edge right now, I'd say, in economic theory. And for our research network, the Entangled Political Economy Research Network, this is something that we center, absolutely center. So through processes of cooperation, competition, conflict, and conflict resolution, there's cooperation is big in econ theory, competition to some extent, but having conflict and conflict resolution sort of representing those alongside cooperation and competition within a system, a single system, not something we've really been able to do very well. So why Syn systems for this? So I've just put his quote, here. So knowledge is local in Synecological Systems Theory. So we have this formally independent thing here in that localness, and can be synecological. So that's in choosing to act in ways that take account of others. So synecological systems can endogenize governance nodes. And so we have these different kinds of governance nodes that can be represented. Herbert Simon problem solving and satisficing. This is something that I would like to be able to do with Syn systems, and this is all processes. So Hayekian plan production, Lachmanian plan combinations, adaptation, emergent solutions. These are all in the processes part of this. Processes does a lot of heavy lifting in this point 3. And it's natural stage, I think, in system theory for ecologically rational behavior to represent that. And this is that sense of choosing. So decision theory is going to be a bit different. And so we have, of course, ecological rationality was another one of Vincent Ostrom's inventions, or discoveries, really. So this is something that comes into decision theory. So what does rationality mean? What does knowledge mean? What kind of knowledge do agents use? How it has to be explicitly represented? In Syn systems theory, you have to explicitly represent that. Adaptation here is, we talked about that. Synergistic channels of entanglement, emergent solutions through synergistic channels of entanglements. This ways, act in ways that take account of each other without even knowing. So that's the synergistic channels part, is this indirect action, is that we're interacting with each other without even knowing that we're interacting with each other. We're utilizing information about the other person somewhere down the line, far away from us, far away from our knowledge. The ways that this person somewhere out there is acting is influencing how we choose. And this is something that agent-based modeling does a pretty good job of showing in, say, network models. That so Rob Axtell has Complexity of Exchange is a great paper where he talks about this kind of effect. And this is something that I would like to explicitly show. So I don't know how much time I have left. Can anyone tell me? Or Marta?
Let's say 10 more minutes. Can you do
okay.
10, 15 max? Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, that's more time than I thought I did. I usually go very long, as anyone will know who's ever watched any one of my talks ever. I always have to speed up at the end. So this is actually great. All right, fine. So let's look at this particular application. So this is Ostrom's Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, or their IAD framework. So I got these from a book, Eleanor Ostrom's book, which I reference at the end of the slides. And so many of you will be very familiar with these figures. And so we've had here, I've got this is the IAD framework fleshes out sort of the exogenous variables over here. So that's the only difference really between right and left. Action arenas here is what I analogize, or what I analogize to games. And I'm not the first person to do this. Eleanor Ostrom analogized action arenas to games too. So this is something that just kind of, seems obvious to do it this way. And the IAD framework here, we've got this fleshing out the exogenous. So we have these action arenas, these interactions, these outcomes from interactions, and you evaluate. So you have to have criteria to evaluate whether you succeeded or failed, or some sort of evaluative criteria. And then these outcomes will then interact with exogenous variables which impinge upon action arenas. So action arenas are always embedded in a larger context. So I want to sort of have some systems flesh out this whole system. So this is the internal structure of an action situation here. So it's like blow up of this little box. This kind of blows that up. So participants are assigned to positions. Actions are assigned to positions. Positions are just like where you're choosing from. This is your position. So where you stand is usually related to where you sit, is a good heuristic way of talking about positions, right? And then you have information about exogenous variables, control over particular exogenous variables, which is then linked to the outcome. And you have to assign some sort of net costs and benefits to these outcomes as well. And so I want to come in here and say, okay, we're getting information about the context in which we're acting, these exogenous variables, from where? So this is part of what systems would do, is answer that question. Positions in what? So this would be in looking at positions as being strategic positions, players who are playing games within some kind of plan. Actions defined with respect to what? So the idea would be some kind of also with respect to one's plan, and with respect to one's knowledge of what other people are doing, and whether there's synergy that you're aware of. Let me just move my little box here. Control, how is control designated? So this is the idea of the designer and the rule maker being embedded within the model. It's people who have hierarchical advantages, power advantages, influence advantages, would have to be explicitly designated as such within the system. One can do this, of course. Influence can be easily represented in a network or a graph theory model where nodes have high degree, so many connections, and with nodes being people usually. So typically are ones that have more influence, and they certainly have more informational influence, which is easy to show. And so we have this sense for which those nodes may have more control or exert more control within the system. But this is an example. The graph theoretical example I just laid out is an example of how one endogenizes or defines within the model what control means. And so then you have the outcomes. Is that the end? Or do the outcomes inputs to some next action arena, or many next action arenas, look at from divergent plans, say. And so I just kind of like copy pasted a bunch of these IED frameworks and connected them together to kind of get this sense for which systems could describe sort of what I did is I got rid of the exogenous variables over here, and I simply contextualized these action arenas as embedded with other action arenas. So the outcomes here lead to exogenous variables. These exogenous variables are then inputs to this game, so this action arena. And this one over here, the outcomes of this action arena are then inputs to this game here. So you have two sets going in, flowing into that one, and the outcomes are then of this game are then feedback into the original game. And so this is the idea of the system, of a system theoretical way of, and I think polycentricity, you're gonna have to represent it in a systems theoretical way for it to make sense. It's a systems theory, really. And so you can't, these disembodied action arenas aren't gonna cut it. And this is something folks in the Austrian workshop like Michael McGinnis have already recognized. And I think Syn Systems, I hope, will have a nice way of being able to create this system. So the big question here is, how do we characterize the stable configuration of institutions that produce solutions or avoid social dilemmas? That's a big question, I'd say, in this Austrian governance. So what could Syn Systems do? What could Syn Systems bring to this? So we here have the original game that we saw above, but now I've listed explicitly what these games are. So the original game we saw above, remember we had 2 players playing a principal agent game. So we have 2 players here, and then we have a market game, which I've called a Corno game. It's just this pi means profits, this profit-taking game here. And I also have a contract game where we something is being sold here, right? So if this is maybe farmers herders who graze land, farmers who own the herd and then want to sell them. The herders are their principal agents, and then the consumers who want to buy the herd. And so you have to have also, Eleanor Ostrom really nicely said, the commons is itself embedded in a larger system of law, of the idea that you can, property rights, that you have property rights to your sheep, and you can sell that sheep, and you then obtain money which you're able to keep. That is now your money. And so this system of property rights. So here I have this system being managed through a guarantor. And so I kind of had smart contracts as a heuristic when I was drawing these relationships up here. And so you have 2 contract games, and you have between 2 consumers, say, and a guarantor who also plays these contract games between the consumer and the farmer. And so this here we have many channels of possible synergistic entanglement. And so I've already shown down here, you can get prisoners' dilemmas out, you can get an assurance game through indirect play here. And these channels I have not yet investigated at all. And here I note that this game is symmetric, and these games are not. And so symmetry is actually important in one-shot, in arguing for the ability for one-shot games to have emergent, entangled games being played. So symmetry just helps, it reduces the knowledge, the amount of knowledge needed for agents to, say, be able to set wages in such a way that induces a prisoner's dilemma between these 2 principal agents. So these are potential ways that we can have synergy arise, and in indirect, we can have an indirect influence between players that are played directly with each other. So what's next? So the next thing to do is conduct a general exploration of these channels of synergistic entanglement. I can use implementation theory for this. This is kind of like the deduction of a game form from. I'm sorry, I just poured water all over my laptop.
It's okay. We can do a short break and just make sure your equipment is okay. No worries.
Sorry, can we just give me a minute?
Yeah, no problem.
This is very bad.
This might be a good moment to just say that, yeah, if you have comments for Abby, put them in the chat, and we will just do a queue for questions. I forgot to say that at the beginning. So we'll do the cue with the raised hand, like, you know, the Zoom hand, whenever she's ready. Your computer appears
Charlotte,
to work, so.
I just poured water all over my laptop.
And yet your laptop is working fine anyway. That's
Yeah, it's
wonderful.
amazing
It is now.
technology.
Goodbye. Goodbye. Say goodbye to people.
Okay, all right, well, okay.
Say goodbye to people. Would you?
I'm sorry.
Okay, we will, how about I ask people for questions and we will just have you.
We'll hope
later.
for your speedy return. Don't worry.
Yes,
It's
we'll-
all
I'm
right.
so sorry.
We're among friends.
All right. Bye-bye. I'm going to
Okay.
try to sign back in with a different device.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's see here. Okay. Oh, she's still here. Okay, what's happening?
Reminds me of the time I was overseas with my one and only computer and spilled a full cup of, I forget if it was coffee or tea on the keyboard. That was a dead computer. Yeah. And so I just was like dead for whatever it was. I was on a month or something. It was a long trip. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was like, well, no.
So what did you do? It's right hand.
I did a lot of things that weren't work. It was a mixed curse, as it were.
Yeah, it's this free sense of freedom, right? Yeah, I think we probably need to give Abby a little bit of time, and maybe she can come back and answer some questions. I see some things in the chat. Oh no, okay, all right, perfect. I wonder, yeah.
I'm trying to understand, if I may speak. I'm just blabbering,
Okay.
Marta. So you can,
Yeah, let's just chat.
you can squelch me. I'm trying to figure out Eric Alston's comments. If institutionalists take rules as the unit of analysis and organizationalists take organizations as the unit of analysis, what is it for synecologists? I'm not sure how to read the question. I mean, it was sort of straightforward, but somehow it's got me, the very question has me perplexed. Are you there, Eric?
Yeah,
There you are.
I was actually just typing a comment saying most of my questions are definitional. I've become convinced I need to read the paper. So in a sense, this was me flailing with some core definitions that are probably laid out in reasonably good detail in the paper that I did not read in advance. And so for me, it's in a sense, organizationalists, or for some institutionalists, organizations don't actually exist. They are just themselves a bundle of rules, a particular nexus of a larger and important subset of rules that are tasked with the power to continue to articulate rules in an ongoing sense.
Yeah.
And so for a synecologist, based on my, again, admittedly very limited understanding based on Abby's presentation, for a synecologist, a key component is the relationship between individuals and a set of communities. I don't even see it as a single community, a set of communities that define the relevant action spaces that, when summed up, it create almost at the end of the presentation, my answer to this question was the unit of analysis is the topology created by the sum of action spaces between the individuals and the set of relevant communities. But again, this is me flailing a little bit in the dark because I haven't read the relevant subset of papers. So I'm not sure this is even a productive discussion for anyone, but I'm convinced I should read the paper is my TLDR.
If I'm allowed another comment, Martin?
Yeah, go ahead, Roger. I don't know how to respond, so.
Well, I mean, you know, he said, Eric said twice he was flailing. That's the way it is when new things are happening. So I can appreciate that quite a bit. I think it's something like, I think the response might be something like this. You know, in this sort of ultimate synecological vision, if you could somehow do it, everything would be endogenous. So, whereas for some of the other isms here, you know, institutionalism or whatever, you've got the atoms, and then you're adding them up, right? And here we have sort of everything endogenized, and we have emergence. Okay, so the ontology is endogenous. Put it like that. The ontology is endogenous. Right. So in some sense, you're right. It's the whole topology that's the sort of unit, right? And then all the stuff that happens in the topology are the isms, institutionalism, organizationalism, that maybe some other schools latch on to. I'm not sure that makes sense. I think it does. What do you think?
It's that helped clarify for me, but it poses further questions, which for me is, if you're formalizing anything, aren't you reducing by at least one level of dimensionality compared to the complexity of everything is contextually specific and unique, which is true. But like if you're formalizing, you're saying like, this is a one, at least as I like to understand it in a sort of a casual philosophical sense, is you're reducing by at least one level of dimensionality compared to the incredible complexity of reality, but because it gives you a tractable set of comparisons between events. And
hey, the star is back. Look.
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yay.
Hi, Abby. Okay. So,
To be continued there.
Abby, how about we give you just a chance to conclude, maybe like one final thought, and then we will open it up to questions, because I think people are eager to ask you questions. And I mean,
Okay.
yeah, we still have like a little bit more than a half an hour. So can you like sort of conclude big picture, and then we move on to questions?
Okay, so the big picture here is that I'm still dealing with the static theory. The static theory is hopefully just by itself able to show the emergence of synergy. And so this is something that is really exciting, actually. And it's a neat implication of a tool that we've been using for many, many years, game theory, just by changing the parameters a little bit and putting it inside a structure. We're seeing some neat things happen. And so this is really, really interesting. And it naturally lends itself then to some kind of agent-based representation where we can have a sort of repeated system, or a system in which agents can choose to participate in games. In which games they will participate in. Games will be almost like objects of choice here because they are parts of plans. And so agents will have plans that they are, that with some sort of outcome, and they will produce those plans. So this plan production will then be, so the plans themselves will be composed of different games, and agents will substitute different games for others to create whatever they need in that intermediate stage to then move on to the next part of the plan. And so you have this idea where there's a combinatorial nature to the internals of any plan. And this gets into Roger and I's other work that we've been doing in terms of production. It's also very Lachmanian in terms of capital combination, that kind of thing. Capital, you're being almost at games. And so it's an exciting area of work that just, I love it because it's it's elegant. It just changed a few simple things using a tool we already used for a long time, we understand fairly well. And we find some new interesting stuff with it. So I'm going to conclude there a little breathlessly, I apologize. And I would love to hear your questions.
Well, kudos for your resilience. Yes, just jumped right in. So thank you for that. Yes. And I'm looking at the queue. So I have Roger, Peter, Erwin, and then Al-Shami. So let's start with Roger. And if you want to ask a question, just do the raise hand.
I'll overcome myself and just go on one thing. I have a lot of notes here. Are you in a position to show that, like, fourth from the last slide or whatever, one of the three boxes? Can you show that, or is that like, dude, that ain't happening with my technological?
I'm sorry, I don't have my PowerPoint.
Yeah, no, forget it. It's all right. But you had the three boxes, and then the arrows were going on. And I'm just looking at that, and I'm like looking at an autocatalytic set.
Yes.
Do you have in here the notion of autocatalysis, of autocatalytic sets, Stu?
Roger, I emailed about like to you and Stu some time ago about how I really think my Sim systems theory is going to be a theory of generalized autocatalytic sets at the end of the day, particularly
Yeah, you're right.
the dynamic one. And so, yeah, absolutely. This is where I'm going. All arrows are pointing towards it. So yeah, I really would like to not fly before I can walk. And first, I would really like to get the static representation nailed down in a nice abstract way. And also the formalism. I think I'm going to have to use finite automata to represent the games, the internals of each game. And I think using that, I can use some nice, there's some nice theory from theory of automata that I can then import in and use. You want to make your life as easy as possible when you're a theorist. So if there are theoretical implications of chained finite automata that already exist and some mathematician worked out because they have a lot of time, that's what mathematicians do in their caves, they worked that out, then I'd love to just import that in. So there's a few things that I need to do here to make this a doable theory. The great thing is that multiple games theory is being done in terms of finite automata for the most part. So and the whole system is not a finite automaton, right? Just the components, just the games. So that's important. Because finite automata finite automata are not they're not able to show certain classes of complexity, of complex behavior. So we don't want to just use finite automata. Yeah. So yep, GACS all the way. Question number 2 from the audience here.
Yeah, that might be me. I think Marta said that I was second in line. And so thank you very much for.
Sorry, yeah, I muted myself in the meantime. I'm sorry.
All right, no. So I in a way, I have kind of a two-part question, one being real general and then one a little bit more specific and very elementary. So you can tell me, first of all, if you think I'm right in what I'm asking, is that it strikes me as the approach you're taking here could be thought of as standing network game theory on its head, because what I thought was so striking was that instead of making the nodes of in a particular graph the players, and then they must play the same game with their neighbors, if I've got it right, you reverse it and you allow the nodes to be games that players can select. And so, okay, so that's my real general question. Is that the right way to look at it?
The right way to look at it is as a bipartite network. So you are going to have one network, which is perhaps a social network, and that network, and then you're going to have another network, which is the game network, the game participation network. And then you have connections between the games and the players. And so it's really a bipartite.
Okay, thanks. That's super. That clears me up on that. And then then my real kind of follow-up question is, I just didn't see if you addressed it. Maybe I missed it, but I wonder if so far your approach is open to agents being partnered together, but they might misperceive the game. So for instance, I'm matched with you. I'm supposed to engage in a game with you, but I think the game's Hawk Dove. You think the game is Stag Hunt. And so we might miscoordinate because I've basically got the wrong understanding of the game. It's like I should have been paying better attention like you were. Okay, so am I right that that's a possibility?
I mean, that's always a refinement. However, the way that, okay, so there's two things going on here. Within each component, I'm keeping knowledge assumptions very general, as in players have the common wisdom, they know that other players know that other players know, all the strategies are possible, all the actions within the strategies and the payoffs within each game component. So the Synecological game then is a larger game, right? And so if you're looking at an agent strategizing with respect to their understanding that they are in a larger system, then that game that they're playing might have they are going to have one understanding of it that is going to be at least slightly different from the understanding of the game, the overall system, really the understanding of the system and how it relates to the play in any given component. They will have at least a little bit of a different understanding from any other player in the game. And so this is because their plans are not going to be exactly the same, and they're not going to be played with exactly the same participants, or you would have, so I do make the assumption that plans aren't entirely coincidence, that you're not playing with somebody in every step of your plan. So that is another assumption that I make, and I think I made in my definitions that I went over very quickly. And so, but within any particular component, the understanding of what the strategies, actions, and membership are is going to be exact, sort of traditional game theory. Sure. Question 3.
Yeah, I think that's me. Thanks, Abigail. In your absence, Eric asked a question that I think I want to sort of continue on. But Eric asked something about the unit of analysis. Mm-hmm. In your framework. I think for me, the question is a little bit broader, and it's about simplicity and generality, perhaps, of the framework. Mm-hmm. And all throughout the talk, right, there's a sort of appeal that other formalizations and other branches of game theory don't take this into account, don't take that into account. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if you have any sort of selection mechanism for why we add one aspect or one way of making it more complex. And right, also for other researchers sort of thinking about this, right? Because I think I have a general sense that entangled political economy, right, sort of recognizes complexity, but then how we are going to represent that will bring up questions about what we're going to add. Right. And so is there, are there choices that you make in that? And
okay. Okay.
Oh, yes, well, I think what you're asking, sorry.
There was a delay, but that, I think that's okay. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Okay, so I asking is, Dick Wagner and I talked a bit before we developed this. We didn't have an idea that this would be a kind of game theory at all. We were just thinking, okay, what does traditional game theory do that kind of rules out a complex phenomena? And one of the things that game theory does that rules it is having heroic knowledge assumptions, because then, you know, you can have one, at least one, with access to all the information about the game, and can, you know, the system itself is closed, of course, and so that person can solve the game. And so we were asking in the beginning, you know, well, this is just not realistic, right? How do we set up? What's the simplest system we can think of where one person can't necessarily solve the game, at least in a one-shot sense? You know, and then repeated, we can think about over time. In fact, the small system that I showed you is almost the primitive. You would need more, you know, you would need more plans in the system for it to representation of the system. But what we were talking about, what Dick came up with was that, oh, he's like, you need at least 3 games, and you need at least, I think he was saying 8 players in the beginning, when we realized it was the minimum that you would need to make sure 3 or 4 players, where not all players play the game. So you make sure not all players play all games. So you make sure that no single person spans all games. And that's all you really need. Is first breakthrough for Synecological games theory was to figure out that what you need is that not all players span all games, and then you're able to get participation in the network. You can get the simple solution of a game. So this presupposition that the game is solvable up front is what we rule out by any player within the game. And so then what does strategizing in kind of environment where agents can't solve the game, in a one-shot sense? And so I think when you start eroding some of the heroic substance to really produce what does econ theory do? It's trying to find fixed points, right? That's what optimization is. That's what maximization, minimization is. That's what we talk about in terms of being able to determine the welfare qualities of any particular system, is that we need fixed points. And we need either a generalized fixed point, which represents the welfare of the system, and of course the potential welfare, whatever, which is, we get so it's just fixed points all the way down. And so you need to erode your assumptions that the attainment of fixed points is not necessarily possible or likely, like upfront. You don't assume in that agents can either solve the game or can solve a system or optimize, or that the system itself, you're making there's no assumptions whereby it's simple for whereby you sort of assume away a process. And so if you are dealing with a theory that's assuming away a process in order to find sort of a coincident result, a static result, a fixed point, then just take away as many assumptions as you need to get to the point where finding fixed points is no longer possible. I don't think finding fixed points is theoretically possible anyway. No, girls in completeness theorem, we have some problems there. Lupulized talked a lot. There's no real computable general equilibrium theory possible because of some issues with the computability of the Bolzano-Weierstrass theorem, which is required to prove that you've discovered a fixed point. And so, but I'm not even going there. And I'm saying, okay, assume you can find fixed points. That's not an interesting system. I think fixed points are artifacts of your system being closed. They aren't real. They aren't discoverable. So erode your assumptions so that you no longer have the ability for your agents to find or solve for fixed points.
Yeah. Can I briefly follow up? Because I think there's two things going on at the same time. So on the one hand, right, you're looking for the minimal requirements that demonstrate then normal game theory, right, already runs into trouble, right? And then you get these minimum conditions of having to have 3 or 4 players and 3 or 4 games, and then after that, right, they get into trouble. But there's also a strand in your talk that seems to be much more constructive, right? Because you could say, well, after that, it just blows up. And we have to resort to, I think this was Eric's original point, either to sort of institutional theory where we analyze the rules, or to write Hayek's pattern predictions. And of course, Hayek has also tried, I think, throughout his career to sometimes find sort of more micro foundations for what he was saying. But even so, right, ultimately he said, it's all we can do is pattern predictions. We can't, right, fully describe these.
You can't do pattern predictions either. I don't buy pattern prediction thesis, so
okay,
that's a whole other ball of wax.
But so yeah, but so is it after these minimal conditions are met that just sort of anything is possible, or how do we constrain the system back, right? Game theory itself already suffers from some issues that you can basically prove any sort of outcome, right?
Yeah,
so how do we constrain your sort of synecological game theory so that it doesn't just tell us that anything can happen in the real world?
Well, listen, the folk theorem is a result of agents having access to all histories. And so they can they can then, they can then, they're then able to access sort of any of the multiple equilibria in, any point of any subgame. Because they understand, they have access to all the histories and all the other players' histories, and that sort of thing. And so that is not something that you even have at all. So I in my dissertation, I have a little section on the folk theorem, and it's just it's a skeletal proof that synecological systems do not have a folk theorem. This indicates that synecological systems don't have this arbitrariness that you suggested, but listen, that comes from them. And also, the folk theorem comes from heroic knowledge assumptions, and so it ties right back into this idea of naturally constraining knowledge. And you're naturally constraining it. You're just saying agents only know about the things they participate in directly. You're not making psychological arguments. You're not having to go into cognitive arguments. People like to make in the multiple games theory literature that's being worked on right now by SF Santa Fe folks. They go a lot into cognitive arguments, and they say, okay, well, we can limit strategies in this particular way because agents are, kind of dumb or something. I don't have to even say that. I can say that agents are. Agent is a Stephen Hawking image because they only know about the things that they participate in, and so I think that what game theory did, there are some issues with game theory, and some of the issues too also come into the being able to always prove that there's a Nash equilibrium. I think is the main thing. There's always one, at least mixed strategy Nash equilibrium. That's Nash's theorem, and that comes. I think that's really represented well in the folk theorem, and the folk theorem does not apply to systems theory because of knowledge constraints. So yeah, I of epistemology being the central point of investigation. We're entangled political economists. If we really keep epistemology, the considerations of epistemology at the heart of our research, we're going to go far. There's a lot that hasn't been done with really having a plausible epistemology in models.
Excellent. I love that that point. With that, let's move on to Al-Shami and then Eric. So Al-Shami, go ahead.
All right, awesome. So I'm going to share a thought, and I'm not sure it's right, but I'd love to get some feedback on it, and I'd love to hear what you guys think. So, and especially Abby. So with synecological game theory seems to have good applications, especially in post-war reconstruction and transitions from monocentric political systems to polycentric political systems. Heterogeneous agents can already be accounted for in agent-based modeling. I think that's the point you were making when you were talking about Vincent Ostrom's conception of polycentric political systems having one part being say heterogeneous agents, and that can be accounted for using agent-based modeling, but the other ones aren't accounted for. And that's essentially, I take your contribution to be trying to integrate these two other conditions into the model that you're working.
Can I just break in on this point?
Sure.
Just to note that agent-based models, as we make them now, as people understand them to be, would just be one component, one action arena. So so I just want to make this point that yes, absolutely, this is bigger than what we can do with agent-based models currently, or what's kind of tractable. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. So what this adds is that the outcomes and rules at the macro level. So say like. And this is obviously relevant when it comes to institutional change, right? At the macro level is a product of games between people where they take each other into account. So this not only shows that there will be coordinative outcomes as a product of, say, localism, but also that institutional change can be made more responsive to local agents in polycentric systems. I think this is quite, again, if I'm understanding this correctly, this is very relevant in post-war reconstruction in countries suffering from a history of fractionalization as a product of heterogeneity plus bad rules, right? Like, for example, a case that I'm looking at right now, my parents are both born in Yemen. And Yemen is in a terrible situation right now. And one of the reasons why this is the case is because there has been a very centralized unitary system in Yemen. And there are a lot of people of different backgrounds, secular, traditionalists, Sunni, Shia, progressive socialists, and neoliberals, whatever you want to call them, right? So a lot of people coming from different perspectives, and they all are trying to capture a very powerful monocentric government. And now one of the things that's on the table is an attempt to create a more polycentric, federalized Yemen. This is after the war, and it seems like this could be. It could show how institutional change how polycentric systems allow government to be more responsive to local agents across time. Even it's not just this static coordination game like the battle of the sexes, right? It's more across time. These institutions are more responsive to the people on the ground. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is my assessment accurate? And yeah, I'd love to hear them.
That I would think is one of the many applications, and a really great one that I hadn't thought that and that I have all the thoughts in my head, just that, I've been thinking of systems for a while, and that's really cool. I mean, the happening, but cool and also cool that we can about it in ways to do. This is the purpose of this really was to characterize institutional change. And I think it's something that there was you and I might have even chatted about this. There was a back and forth about one of Pete Leeson's papers that looks at how sort of everything is coincident. And this is a great way to be able to describe economic systems. And then, and I think there was a response to this by Pete Becky, where he said, yeah, it's a good tool for many things, but it cannot talk about institutional change. It cannot represent institutional change. I mean, necessarily, as assumed, it's a static theory. And so this is kind of the idea: is these action arenas that people engage in are objects of choice. And so, where do I participate? And that also might depend on my social networks. The idea of the bipartite network here is that you have a social network where you have clusters of people together in different kinds of communities. Could be religious communities, for instance, could be geographic, cultural, and that you have that these impinge upon the action arenas people might even participate in the first place, and also impinges upon you have influence flowing from the social network through the action arenas, and also if any change occurs, it will be driven by the underlying social network. And so, and I really think that you can't get at what institutional change, how to be able to represent that just by looking at the social network. This is the idea that it's not just enough to have one social network playing, like a social network playing one game with each other. That's like an agent-based model. That's just not enough. And it's not just enough to look at, a single stage game, competed game. That's not enough. And so this is kind of like the minimal layering that I think could be enough. And so I talked with Cameron Harwick, who's not usually in these meetings. He's not today because he teaches during this time, and he and I are talking about an agent-based model. So this would be like a meta agent-based model that would be treating games themselves as objects of choice. And this is something Dick Wagner and I have been talking about for years. This is kind of where we want to get to. And it's surprisingly hard. It's been much harder to develop this than I expected, but it's rewarding because I am making incremental progress. But yeah, this is absolutely where we want to go. And I think generalized autocatalytic sets is a nice way. This is like production as chemistry. If you've ever read any of that work by Paget, he talks about this kind of thing. And Sue Kaufman also has a few papers on this. But this, I think we can treat, games themselves as combining with each other in certain ways and that produce certain outcomes. You can almost think of them as chemicals, and you have catalysts that also combine in the system to produce certain things, certain outcomes. So this might be democracy, this might be, a certain kind of polycentric system. This might be a monarchy. This might be, theocracy. And so we think about the ways in which, how do we get certain outcomes by the combination of underlying elements, and what should those elements be? It's a very basic theoretical investigation. And so I hope Syn systems is a way of, in looking at these elements as action arenas, which can be represented as games, is a way of getting to a dynamic representation of social systems that can then be changed. So, I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it did. And it's not surprising that it'd be incredibly difficult to model changes that within agents themselves. That sounds quite obvious that it'd be so difficult. But yeah.
Okay, so next up we have Eric, but Eric, I just want to ask one clarifying question, and I think it's just sort of like a yes or no question, I hope. Well, no, I want a good, actually, no. At the risk that this is not a yes or no, how about you ask your question first, and I will wait. Sorry.
Cool. So my question surrounds, and I'm forgetting the slide, but you characterized a subset of relationships as symmetric and another subset of relationships as asymmetric. And it appeared that the characterization of the asymmetric relationships was that of a principal agent or something shorthanded. So one is like a clarifying question, which is exactly what you meant by symmetric relationships and asymmetric relationships, but I'll give you just a flavor of my context of interest, which comes from organizational economics. Mm-hmm. I've been working on formalizing an understanding of the relationships that exist among members of a single organization. So definitely many orders reduced in terms of complexity compared to the systems you're trying to describe. But central to my co-authors and I's characterization of these relationships is that they exist on a continuum from pure agency costs to pure coordination costs, which is a function of the decision rights. So if two members of an organization have perfect decision rights as compared to one another and cannot command one another, the nature of their relationship can be understood as one of coordination. Whereas if somebody can perfectly command someone within the scope of their duties to do something, and that other person has no decision rights with respect to doing that thing, that is one of a pure agency relationship.
Right.
But kind of central to our conception is that every relationship we can think of is imperfectly situated on a continuum between these endpoints. And so I guess part of my interest in people choosing game contexts, but also being subject to game contexts that they don't have full scope of choice over, is your characterization of those game contexts one of like pure agency or pure coordination, or does it allow for some position on a continuum between them?
Okay, so when it comes to the exact representation of the theory, which is more analytical at this point, I am not allowing for the continuum. This is just to sort of make it tractable. However, this is all going to be agentized in agent-based models. And so in my dissertation, I have an agent-based model that is just representing that small situation. So when it comes to symmetric, what I mean by that is that you have a game that is left-right symmetric, where you have the same, say you have two principal agent games on the outside and a porno game on the inside or something like this. This game can be seen as, if you split it down the middle, you have the same system left and right, or same subsystems left and right. You split it down the middle. And so a symmetric game and is sort of the original person who utilized this kind of system to be able to discover that one could entangle agents in agent configuration in a prisoner's dilemma. And so he said that in order to do this, if you were to do it analytically, you know, if the relationship here being the people who, the owners, the employers who play sort of the profit game, who manage the principals who manage the agents. I'm sorry if I'm going back and forth. The principals are the ones who are trying to solve this problem, the principal agent problem, by incentivizing their agents to produce more effort or whatever it is, given that there is a problem here with asymmetric information. And so that they can utilize the symmetry of the game, knowing that the other employer that they are competing with on the market is also facing the same issue. And so if you want to analytically solve this, then you can make the principals can discover incentive wages that effectively entangle their agents in prisoner's dilemma. And I also show that you can do the same thing to entangle them in an assurance game, and there's probably a whole family of games that you can entangle them in. And so you're utilizing the symmetric nature of the system. And so the asymmetric case would be an extension. You would have to have some other argument for why the principals are able to deduce, and maybe instead of deducing, they're inducing. So you can use some kind of incremental knowledge that they're gaining over time by playing this game many times about how to arrive at an incentive wage on both sides that entangles, or however you want to characterize the system. Wages aren't going to be always what that are utilizable by other agents. It could be other things. So that's, but when it comes to the agent-based representation, it's going to completely be on a spectrum, because agents are going to be using inductive learning methods. They're not going to be deducing anything from their purported knowledge of the system. It would be inductive.
So
that answers it.
Yeah, no, that was helpful. And while you were cut off, I noted that I needed to read your paper because some of my issues are clearly definitional, which is I just need to figure out what you mean by a term before quibbling with your downstream implications of the use of that term. But based on your comments, it seems like, at least for the external observer, trying to understand more about the dynamics of the complex system that you're describing with more granularity, an important consideration for making sense of the system is role symmetry, in terms of, because you said, so you've got an employer that's playing a game with another employer, and their role symmetry is determining the well understood incentives between two different employers. And so in some sense, the roles that or the relevant set of other game players seems determined, at least partially determined, by role symmetry. Is that
in the one-off case where we actually have analytical solutions, or the attempt to find analytical solutions? Yes, but I see the analytical solutions as being fragile and a bit of a crutch, and so for me, inductive reasoning will I want to rule the day. In systems, I want inductive reasoning to be what people are using. Deductive reasoning, I think, is incredibly fragile, especially in systems. And so, but role symmetry is like a heuristic, provides a heuristic. And I think for the most part, it's a pretty good heuristic that people can use. For the most part, they, when they're interacting with, a firm about their size that does a particular kind of thing, you kind of have an idea of the internals of the firm, and you can make a pretty good assumption about the internals of the firm, and you can use that knowledge. And so, is that a kind of synecological knowledge? Maybe Roger can weigh in on that, because It's derived from a social structure as an exosomatic is the firm, representing some kind of knowledge here. And so the structure of the firm itself, but yeah, so it's I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Roger, do you have a final comment? No? Okay, so we shall stop here. You actually answered my question in the previous response to Eric. So thank you for that. Thank you for an excellent presentation and for powering through despite the obstacles. And yeah, I appreciate that. And I hope to see you all in May. Enjoy your spring. Thank you. Bye-bye. Yeah. Good job.
Thanks, everyone.